So I want to welcome you to the Alden Kindred of America's presentation of the Native American artifacts from the Alden First Site, a reanalysis. My name is Desiree Mobad, and I'm the executive director. The Alden Kindred preserves and shares the legacy of Mayflower passengers, John and Priscilla Alden, at their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts, through guided tours, educational programs, exhibitions, publications, and genealogical research. I'd like to offer a special welcome to our members who are joining us on Zoom and in person today, whose support helps make programs like this possible. We are honored to welcome archaeologist Daniel Zoto for an overview of his recent project to reanalyze the nearly 2,000 Native American artifacts uncovered during an excavation of John and Priscilla Alden's 17th century home site that was done in 1960 by Roland Robbins. This home site is located just a few yards behind the library where we are today in a roped off area marked with signage. You can see the artifacts from this dig on exhibit at the Alden House. Daniel is a professional archaeologist who's done extensive public outreach with the Cape Cod Museum of Natural History. His research interests include the archaeology of New England, stone tool technology, lithic sourcing, coastal archaeology, and cultural resource management. I want to say thank you to the Duxbury Cultural Council for their support of this presentation. And now, Daniel, why don't you take it over?
Thank you, Desiree. I really appreciate the introduction. So hello and welcome to everyone here and on Zoom. As Desiree said, my name is Dan Zoto. I'm an archaeologist that works in cultural resource management. That's a sector of archaeology that goes out ahead of certain construction projects, looks for ancient Native American or early historical period archaeological sites, and we try to mitigate any adverse effect that that construction might have on the archaeological site, either by avoiding it or excavating a portion of the site to learn something about it before it might be impacted. That is primarily what I do, but I also do collections analysis, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I would like to take a moment before we start to acknowledge that we are on ancestral Wampanoag land. I think that's something we should think about throughout the presentation. I'm going to be talking a lot about artifacts and objects, but as archaeologists, we use these artifacts to learn about people in the past. I would also like to apologize to my wife, Brianna, because tonight is our wedding anniversary. And I should have considered that when I said yes to give a talk on October 2nd. But as a good husband, that slipped my mind. So sorry to Bree. And I say hi to my Aunt Carol and cousin Tom that came. Awesome. I've never had family come to a talk before. So tonight, to give an outline of the talk, first I'm going to give an overview of the project. I'm going to talk about the excavation that these artifacts came from. I'm going to give a little bit of the history of this artifact collection and how it has moved around to different universities in the region. Different studies have been conducted with it, and talk about how I ended up doing the reanalysis of the native artifacts. I'm going to present some sort of high-level overview of some of the things I found, and then try to tie it all together to give a little bit of a picture of what life would have been like at the first Alden site before the Alden family arrived in the 1620s. So, project overview, my introduction to the Alden Kindred. It came in 2022 when they contracted me to do an archaeological survey for a new visitor center at the standing Alden House, which is a museum, a living history museum that is right around the corner from where we are at the library today. After completion of that project, there was discussion about analyzing the almost 2,000 artifacts that came from the 1960 excavation of the Alden first site. And the purpose of analyzing that collection was to see if new information could be gleaned and if the Alden Kindred were interested in presenting a more inclusive history of the property and the site that included the Wampanoag that also lived there. The Alden Kindred obtained grant money from the Rockland Trust Charitable Foundation and the Duxbury Cultural Council to do this project. And the analysis that I did was conducted over the winter and spring of 2024. So to start, I'm showing a map of where we are. The star marks the location of the first Alden site. This is the circa 1627 house that was constructed by John and Priscilla Alden. And we are at the library right there. So this is basically in the athletic fields or across from the athletic fields behind the library. Also showing one of the stone tools from the collection. This is an approximately 3,000-year-old spear point that was recovered during that excavation. Excuse me, projectile point. And this one, based on the asymmetric blade and that has been resharpened on one side more extensively than the other, I think it probably was used as a knife. And it's just sort of giving a little highlight of some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. So this collection came from Roland Robbins' 1960 excavation of the Alden first site. He was contracted by the Alden Kindred to find the 1627 homestead. Roland Robbins was a very well-known amateur archaeologist. He had no formal training in archaeology, but he was very meticulous in his methods and recording and reporting for most of his projects. And that includes his excavation of the Alden first site. Now, while saying that Robbins was very meticulous, I will also say that this site was excavated rather quickly. His group of volunteers conducted the complete excavation in about 2 weeks. A professional crew today would take 1 to 3 months just to do the excavation, never mind all the analysis and whatnot. However, he did leave a really good record of everything that he did. So to find the site, Robbins was a very smart guy, and he started where there was a monument erected in 1888 that said this is the location of the John Alden house from 1627. I probably would have also started at the monument that says this is where the house is. And to try to locate the buried foundation, Robbins probed around the monument with a metal rod looking for foundation stones. When he hit something that he thought was a foundation stone, he dug a small hole, found, yes, this is part of the foundation, and then was able to use that metal rod to trace out the rest of it. So he knew before he even really opened up the ground where this foundation was buried. He then established a grid across the top of it. So everything that was excavated had really good horizontal control, which is important for interpreting the site and doing archaeology. Archaeologists are all about the patterns of the materials in the ground, not just what they were. So we have really good horizontal control. Robbins was not as concerned with the vertical placement of artifacts, and I believe that is mostly because this is a buried house site that is essentially a filled cellar. And Robbins knew that, and he thought that the filling happened very rapidly. So he didn't pay much attention to the vertical stratigraphy. But again, we do have really good horizontal control, and every square that yielded artifacts, we have that information. We know where the stuff came from on the landscape, which is important. Robbins did and actually a pretty complete analysis of his excavation results. This was first a report in 1964, and it was later published as a book in 1969. However, this mostly focused on the colonial aspects of the excavation, which makes sense. The goal was to find the John and Priscilla Alden homestead, so he focused his efforts on artifacts that would have been associated with the Alden family. He did a very preliminary analysis of the Native American materials, giving a count. He had 1,988 artifacts that he classified as being Native American. And he did a rough sorting into tool types like projectile points, ground stone, and then chipping debris, the byproduct of making stone tools. And I have a photo here from that report that shows a representation of some of those artifacts that Robbins found. And this and the count is really the extent of his analysis. Robbins also thought that the animal bone in the marine shell from the site was probably associated with the Native American component. However, later analyses by Tanya Largy and UMass Amherst Archaeological Services determined there was a mix of wild and domesticated animal species in there. So the animal bones and the shellfish are probably related to both occupations, the Native American and the Alden family. Sometime after 1964, Robbins transferred the collection to the Alden Kindred, who stored it in the attic of the standing 1653 Alden house. If we fast forward to the mid-1990s, UMass Amherst Archaeological Services conducted a survey of that standing Alden house, the property around it, looking for a suitable place to reconstruct the barn as an administrative building and for displays and things like that for the museum. During that excavation, they were shown the Robbins collection that was in the attic of the 1653 house. And they found it to be in precarious conditions. The boxes were deteriorating, the labels were falling off bags, some of the bags were ripping, and they thought that the collection needed to be stabilized. They got grant money from the university to do that. The collection was moved to UMass Amherst, where it was stabilized and cataloged. However, and they cataloged all of the Native American artifacts also. However, they did not produce a report that had any type of interpretation. And while there were some publications on the colonial artifacts, nothing had yet come out about the Native American material. As I'm going to be a little critical here, I'm going to say all this with love because my first job was at UMass Arch Services, and I have a lot of mentors that work there, and I have a lot of love for that place. But I must say there are some issues with their analysis. And number one is they used the aardvark coding system to create their catalog. This was a state-of-the-art computer cataloging system that was developed in the mid-1980s at UMass. But using it today is the equivalent of trying to learn an extinct foreign language. So instead of saying this artifact is a quartz biface thinning flake, you have a 9-digit code that represents that. There's a key to that code, but you would have to look up every single artifact to see what it really says. And it's difficult to interpret. It's cumbersome to use. Sorry, that was my phone. So that was one reason to do the reanalysis. Another issue with the UMass analysis is at some point after it was conducted, all of the artifacts got mixed into their bags that were associated with those squares that Robbins excavated. So the example I'm showing here, we have 32 different lithic or stone artifacts in a bag that comes from Robbins' F22 unit, which is great. Each one of these has an individual tag with its own ID number that coincides with this catalog. But because they're all thrown in the bag together, you really can't separate them out and figure out what artifact was called what. And the goal of a curated collection is that any future researcher should be able to pick out exactly what artifact they're looking at very quickly. Everything should be readily available in its own bag numerically and so forth. So this, again, it makes the UMass analysis difficult to use. In 2016, the collection was transferred to UMass Boston for additional study by historical archaeology graduate students. And so far, there have been 3 master's theses that have been written on different aspects of the collection. All of them have been historic. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into detail about these. We're just letting you know that UMass has been conducting studies on the Alden assemblage, but no one had looked at the Native American artifacts yet. And it didn't seem like there was interest in any of the incoming graduate students to take this on as a project. So Desiree and the Alden Kindred thought that, maybe I would be a good option to analyze this. And this was supported by the folks like Dr. Krista Baronic and David Landon at UMass Boston, which I'm very grateful for. And yeah. So when I picked up the collection in November of 2023, it basically looked like this. It was in 4 banker's boxes, all bagged by provenience, basically the same condition that UMass Amherst had left them in. I looked at a total of 1,830, I looked at 1,894 items that were within this collection, 1,832 of which were Native American artifacts. There were other non-cultural stones and some other oddball things in there that I think Robbins thought were Native artifacts when he collected them. And I kept those with the collection to keep it whole. They're just cataloged as non-cultural stones, and they have their own ID number and everything. So when I returned the collection, everything, either individual artifacts or small groupings of artifacts, were given individual catalog numbers. I used curation quality 4mm plastic bags with the white label so that any writing on them is not going to wear off. And then I included a paper tag with all of the contextual information in every one, so that a future researcher that is interested in looking at this collection, or maybe sees this on Zoom today and says, hey, I want to see what Zoto called this, they can easily go and pull that artifact, which could not be done previously based on the condition of the collection. So what did I find? I'm going to get into the meat of it. And over the next few slides, I'm going to break down the analysis results into broad categories that I used as discussion sections in my report. And the first thing I want to look at is the different cultural periods that are represented. So archaeologists divide the past into slices of time that have arbitrary names. And these are periods where artifacts, settlement patterns, and lifeways are generally similar. So we lump them together and we'll call them something like the late Archaic period. And we do that just makes it easier to talk about the past. I determined the different cultural periods that were present at the Alden site based on diagnostic artifacts. These are artifacts that have attributes that are only made for a certain length of time. And in southern New England, we're talking mostly about projectile points, arrowheads, and ceramics. So that's how I determined what cultural periods were there. To determine the age of these occupations, it used relative dating, where I looked at the type of projectile points or ceramics that are present in the collection. I'll give you an example. On the top right corner here, we have an Orient fishtail projectile point. You cannot date this artifact on its own, but you could date it if it's found in association with organic material that can be radiocarbon dated. And every time this is found with material that is radiocarbon dated, you get a date that comes back between 3,200 and 2,700 years ago. I can find just that artifact, recognize its type, and I can give a 500-year span of when it was made or used. If I had a radiocarbon date, I might be able to give a 30 or 60-year span of when that artifact was used in the past. But everything in this collection here was dated relatively, just based on artifact typology. So based on these artifact types, we have occupations at the site dating back 8,000 years at least. The oldest artifact in the collection is this reworked Neville point down here at the bottom. It's somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 years old. And the most intensive occupation of the site is after 1000 AD, what archaeologists call the late woodland period into the contact period. And I determined that just based on the counts of diagnostic artifacts. More artifacts that date to a particular period means that there are more people there. It's a longer duration occupation. There's more activity. So we had more artifacts that date to the late woodland and contact period than any others at the site. That's not surprising. It fits the general pattern of southern New England, where your largest populations are right before, the 500 years or so before European contact. And at that time, in the late woodland and into the contact period, this is the Native American life that was described by the early European explorers. These people are living in semi-permanent villages. They are engaged in small-scale agriculture. They're also hunting and gathering as well. But they tend to be living in these semi-permanent areas or sites. They're leaving a lot of debris behind. And I think that a lot of the artifacts from this Alden site date to that period. The older occupations, we have some, that date 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, 4 to 6, all the way back to 8. They're probably short-term encampments for hunting and gathering or other specialized tasks focused on the resources provided by the Bluefish River. I want to show some of that late woodland and contact period material. On the right, I have an image showing many of the Levana projectile points that were found at the site. These are arrowheads that are a hallmark of that late woodland period. You might notice that a lot of them are broken, and that's not uncommon at all. Most of the artifacts that we find archaeologically are broken or worn out in some way. And that's because people use things to their fullest extent in the past before they discarded them. And I think there's often a lot of misconceptions when someone will find an artifact that is lost. And I don't think people are constantly losing everything in the past. They purposely throw things away that are no longer useful to them, just like we do today. Just something I wanted to point out. Other artifacts that date to the late woodland period are some ceramic sherds from the site. This one is heavily decorated. It's indicative of that period, that 500-year period before European contact. It's interesting that there are only 23 pieces of native ceramic from the site. I have a feeling that there are probably a lot more out there, but they were missed by Robbins and his group of volunteers. And to show the possibility of that, this other ceramic sherd here that is undecorated, it really just looks like a hard piece of dirt. And I think if you don't have formal training, it might be something that you don't realize is in your screen. And I've certainly been on professional excavations where no one is finding ceramics until somebody notices it. And then we all realize that, oh, we have this in our screens too. So I only say that because I think that the overall pattern of the site would suggest that there would be more ceramics there. The other artifact that I have on the slide here are these 3 gunflints, which are all made of quartz. Gunflints are a piece of stone that was inserted into a flintlock musket or pistol. You pull the trigger, the metal hammer comes down, hits the rock, creates a spark that will ignite the gunpowder and fire the weapon. They are very common artifacts in colonial America. Most of them were made in Europe on really fine European flints and then sold to the colonies, like Plymouth. The interesting thing about these are they are all made of quartz, which is a locally available stone that has the correct properties to predictably be shaped into something. And they're very well made. So I have a feeling that these were made by an indigenous person that has some knowledge of flint knapping. Somebody that knew what they were doing made these. Whether they represent a native occupation that existed at the site post-European contact, so say post 1500 AD, but before the Aldens arrive in 1627, that's a possibility. Or these could have belonged to the Alden family and maybe were produced by neighboring Native Americans that traded to the colonists. There are other examples of quartz gun flints in southern New England, although they're rare. And some of them are very hastily made. And you can tell that this is a European person that has no idea what they're doing, trying to make a rock that could create a spark for their gun. But these ones here, I think that they're pretty formally made and are probably related to the indigenous occupation, whether it be before or contemporary with the Aldens. There were many different types of stone tools at the site, and they give indications of different activities and behaviors that occurred there. Most of the formal stone tools were projectile points, which we talked a little bit about. But in these next few slides, I'm going to go over some of the other classes of stone tools that are present in the collection. On this slide, I'm showing cores and bifaces, and these are both associated with the production of stone tools. A core is basically the exhausted center of a cobble. If you have a quartz cobble like this and you're going to make a bunch of arrowheads out of it, you might knock usable pieces off, use them to create your tool. And what you're left over with is this sort of very small center of the cobble that you can't do anything else with. That's then discarded. That's what we have here. Oh, keep doing that. And then on this side of the slide, we have bifaces. And these are sort of a tool that is in progress between a hunk of raw material and a finished formal projectile point. I have the trajectory shown on the bottom here, where you have a cobble, say a beach cobble. You're going to rough out a blank. It gets a little more refined, and then you have your finished projectile point. A lot of the bifaces are broken. They seem to be broken during the manufacturing stage. So that tells me, again, stone tools are being produced on the site. There are a few of them that have shapes that are distinct enough, like this triangle here, to take a guess at what they might have become. And the most common shape in the bifaces was a triangle, which fits with the projectile point assemblage, all those Levana triangle points. So some of these definitely date to that late woodland period. The other ones, it's unclear. Other types of tools we have on the site are scrapers and drills and perforators. Scrapers are small points with one very steep edge. And as their name implies, they are used for scraping activities, whether it be scraping a hide, if you're going to, scraping hides to prepare clothing, make containers, wall hangings, whatever you might use deer leather for, you need this type of tool. Microscopic use wear analysis, where they look at the edge, and coupled with experimental archaeology, where people make these today and then they use them on different materials like bone and wood, archaeologists have determined that a lot of scrapers were not just for scraping hides, but they were used to carve bone, wood, and antler, possibly to make things like short handles for stone knives, maybe food containers, artwork, all kinds of things. So again, this suggests a range of activity at the site. We also had 3 drills or perforators. The one on the right is the most complete. These would have been used in any type of drilling or perforating task, whether it be punching holes in leather to make clothing or bark to make containers. And they can be used to drill other stones. And I will show some drilled stones later in the presentation. But again, the point of showing these is showing a variety of tools that are present at the site. There's a variety of activities going on. This is more indicative of a habitation site than just a short-term encampment. And we also had an assortment of groundstone tools at the site. These are heavy woodworking tools like axes and adzes and gouges, or plant processing tools like pestles, and fishing implements like plummets and net sinkers. Groundstone originated during the early and middle Archaic periods between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago in the region, and they are generally considered to represent less mobile populations. You're not going to make really big, heavy, cumbersome tools if you are moving great distances around the landscape all the time. And if you are not, staying in one place for some duration of time, you're probably not going to be engaged in activities like cutting down trees to clear the land. It's not worth it for you. Unfortunately, most groundstone tools are not diagnostic. Once they started producing these in these shapes, 8 or so thousand years ago, they don't change until European contact. That's not a golden rule, and the axe here with the full groove is probably associated with the earlier Archaic period occupations before 3,000 years ago at the site. This particular artifact is heavily battered and it is very short, probably was used for a very long time. I'm not sure what the lifespan of an artifact like this is. I've heard people say that they could have been handed down for generations. I think that's totally possible. I think the longevity of this particular tool is really dependent on that individual piece of rock and what you are using it for. Other sort of interesting groundstone tools that we have at the Alden site are these 3 pestle fragments, and they represent 3 pestles because they are different. They're not all different types of stone, but you can tell that these are individually made from different rocks. Pestles are plant processing tools. You might be grinding something like maize to make a flour. It could be acorns, hickory nuts. So people use these to process both domesticated and wild plant foods. I would guess that they are most likely associated with that late woodland occupation, just because we know people are planting crops at that time. These tools are prevalent during that time period and is based on the diagnostic projectile points in ceramics. This is the period that has the most occupation at this site. And then on the right, I have a top fragment of a very large pestle. For those of you that are here, we do have some artifacts on a chair over there, and there are some really large pestles that you could take a look at. Plummets. This one here probably functioned as a net sinker. It could have been right there in the Bluefish River, stringing a net across the river to harvest either anadromous fish that are coming up in the spring to spawn, or I would guess that there are bluefish in that river based on its name, maybe schools of striped bass. But I have a feeling this was probably used locally. The smaller sizes of this artifact, which we have examples of on the chair, and I'll show later, they function like lead weights for fishing today in bottom fishing, where they'd be attached to a line. The weight rests on the bottom, your hook floats above it, and you're catching fish like cod or scup or something like that. So we do have some of those at the site also. So we know that people are engaged in plant processing. They're doing some type of heavy woodworking, whether it's felling trees, splitting firewood, making weetus, and they are fishing at this site. Now, the most common artifact type at the site is debitage or chipping debris. This is the byproduct of making or maintaining stone tools. These are all the little flakes of stones that come off in that flint knapping process. There were 1,699 pieces of debitage in the collection. A lot of people think this is a very boring artifact class, but I absolutely love it because it gives you indications of the flint knapping process. You can look at the types of flakes that are coming off or that you have in your assemblage and figure out maybe what types of tools people are making. You can look at the types of stones that comprise these, figure out where people are getting their rocks, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. But I'm not surprised that there are so many pieces of debitage in the collection. It's the most common artifact, I would say, worldwide. Ever since human ancestors began making stone tools some 2 million years ago, these flakes are being produced. Now, someone might take the tool that they're making and bring that elsewhere, but the potential hundreds of flakes that come off in the process are usually left on the ground on the site. And when we go out looking for archaeological sites, this is usually what we find, and we use concentrations of this to sort of hone in on hotspots at the site. One thing that I think is really important about the debitage in this collection is it gives a little insight to Roland Robbins' methodology. He gave a detailed description of all of his methods. However, he did not say what size screen he used to sift the soil. Today, we use 1/4 inch as the industry standard, but due to the large size of the flakes, I think that he probably used 1/2 inch. And we have, based on all the different attributes, I know that every stage of tool making, from the initial breaking up of beach cobbles to the fine finishing, happened at this site. But a lot of that finishing small debitage is missing. There's just a few pieces that have the correct attributes that I know that they are, from that fine edge work, but the small stuff is all gone. And there's no other explanation for it except that he was using screen that was too large to recover. There's no way you would have everything else but that. Another one of my favorite topics is lithic raw material, stone materials. What types of stone are present at this site, and where do they come from? Now, based on the debitage, a lot of the flakes, I think about 15% of them, had smooth cobble cortex on the outside. That's the weathered surface of the cobble. Being smooth like that, they're probably getting their tool stone from beach cobbles. And here in Eastern Massachusetts, there are only certain types of stones that have the correct fracture properties to be predictably chipped and shaped. And those are rhyolite, quartz, and quartzite. And on Duxbury Beach, which is 2 miles east of the site, and Brant Rock Beach, which is 4 miles to the northeast of the site, there are an abundance of these types of cobbles. I have a feeling that people at this site are getting their tool stone from that location. If you're paddling in a canoe, it's really not that far. Or if even walking, you can carry a cobble or two home with you. Absolutely, I do it all the time. About 96% of the material in the collection could be obtained within 4 miles of the site. So they are getting most of their material locally. However, there are 2 different classes of more exotic stones. One is that there were 13 pieces, which I only have 12 shown here, of European flints in the collection. These are actually rocks that came over here from Europe during the colonial era. And how they arrived was that early European traders would load their boats in Europe with ballast cobbles to balance the ship. They sail across the ocean, they dump their ballast on the shore, and then they load their ship with resources like timber or fish or something like that, sail back to Europe. It didn't take the Native Americans around here very long to figure out that there's really high quality tool stone in these piles of ballast cobbles. So I think they are getting flint to make tools from these sources. And there are some that have that outer cobble cortex on them that confirms they probably came from cobbles. And this one here is a preform of one of those Levana projectile points that's made of European flint. And that the presence of that artifact and the fact that most of these flakes look like they were produced by someone that knows what they're doing, I believe that these are associated with the indigenous occupation, and it's not the Aldens trying to make gun flints out of flint cobbles like that. So oddly enough, because I think that they're getting these from ballast cobbles along the beach, I considered the European flint to be local in my analysis, because they are locally acquiring that tool stone. Again, you could probably find it within 4 miles of the site. There are some high quality cherts and other stones that come from further away. There's some pieces of Normanskill chert, which outcrops in the Hudson Valley. There are other gray and brown cherts that are either from New York State or Maine in the collection. And there is one piece of yellow-brown jasper that's probably from southeastern Pennsylvania. The presence of these stones tell me that people at the site were engaged in trade with groups further away. And archaeologists love to trace the movement of people or connections that people have by tracing rocks moving around the landscape. You know, if I know that this green chert here only outcrops in the central Hudson Valley, but I have it at a site here in eastern Massachusetts, and there's no natural explanation for this stone to get here. It's not like the glacier, you know, hit New York City and then banged a, I don't know what, banged the left and came out here. You know, that rock was brought here by a person. And I think that's a fun thing to think about. I'm not sure what was traded from this area out that way. We don't have really anything non-perishable that's found in New York State to suggest what people are exchanging for this rock. It's probably something perishable like beaver pelts or some kind of food stuff or something like that. Now, as a side project to this collection, I analyzed the Alpheus Walker collection, who surface collected artifacts in the vicinity of the Alden House in the 1950s. I believe a lot of them came from the construction of the school complex here or the expansion of that school complex. This collection contained 189 native artifacts. Alpheus did not pick up any of those little pieces of debitage, which is very common for collectors. They are focused on complete or nearly complete projectile points and other recognizable tools. This collection is considered to be separate but related to the Alden site. It's probably from the vicinity. Some of it could have been picked up from right where the foundation is, but because the rest of the collection is from a known excavation, they are kept separately and they are recorded separately with the Massachusetts Historical Commission, given a different site number. I'm not going to get into that for the sake of time. The collection basically mimics that of Roland Robbins, where you have 8,000 years of occupation represented. You have a variety of tool types, mostly projectile points, but there were also scrapers, drills, things like that in the collection, and groundstone tools. There are different, we have an axe here, number 131. There's a couple of plummets. One thing that Walker had that Robbins did not are these drilled stone artifacts at the top. And earlier in the presentation, I showed some stone drills And they could have been used to perforate these pendant or gorget fragments. And these are basically items of personal adornment, maybe worn like a necklace or some other way. You can tell these holes are drilled with stone and not metal because they are biconically drilled. The drill comes in from both sides and it meets in the middle. You basically have two cones that connect. So those are, legitimate indigenous artifacts. So putting this all together, what do these artifacts tell us? And basically, they tell us that we have a domestic Native American habitation site that was reoccupied intermittently over approximately the last 8,000 years, I assume by Wampanoag and their ancestors. The most intense occupation happened after 1000 AD up until European contact. It is very likely that the site was occupied until just before the Aldens arrived in 1627. It's not uncommon for the earliest English settlements in Plymouth Colony to be in places of large native sites because the land was already cleared. It's manicured, they've done pruning, they have improved upon that. And it was easier for the Europeans who were arriving to settle in places that already had old cornfields and things like that. So they could fodder their livestock and so forth. The site included evidence for a variety of activities, including stone tool manufacture from local beach cobbles, food processing, the ceramics, some of the other cutting tools might be used for that. And then, heavy woodworking activities from the ground stone. There's fishing, evidenced by the plummets and net sinkers. And you have other cutting and scraping tools for different types of specialized or just ordinary everyday activities. So we have a lot going on. And the images I'm showing here are really just things I grabbed online. We have a wetu or wigwam in the bottom, on the bottom. I'm so bad at this. I'm facing this way, the bottom right. This is probably what some of the structures at the site looked like when people were living there. I have an image from the Plymouth Patuxet village, the Wampanoag village there that was featured in Yankee magazine. And this just sort of gives a visual aid of some of the other structures that might have existed there. This is a group that is cooking something. And then I am showing the activity of flint knapping because we know that a lot of that occurred at the site. And we have again, the full reduction sequence from that beach cobble to the finish and discarded tools. So there are still some avenues of future research. I give a very high level overview, but there's a lot more detail to the analysis in the report that I presented to the Alden Kindred. But there are still a few things that we could look at. And one that was suggested by Dr. Baranek at UMass Boston was to compare the spatial distribution of contact period material with the distribution of the Alden artifacts, especially ceramics, that were analyzed by one of the graduate students, Caroline Gardner, who was able to figure out where different rooms were in the house, different activity areas associated with the Alden family. And it will be interesting to see if the contact period Native American artifacts match up with that in any way. And that might suggest some that they might be contemporary occupations. And maybe that will shed insight into my ideas about Native people trading the quartz gunflints to the Aldens. And if that is successful, you could do the same thing with the late woodland period materials to try to separate those from the contact period. It's a very difficult thing to do in New England archaeology. Basically, you need European goods or something like European flint to say that it is a contact period site. A lot of times I I have a feeling a lot of contact period sites are missed because they only have what we consider late woodland stuff because, you know, that glass bead isn't there or something like that. But the material representation of those two periods is so similar that it's difficult to separate. So I wonder if some spatial analysis could do that. There's potential to do use wear on some of the tools to figure out exactly what it was used for. But I'm not sure that is totally warranted in this sense. I would maybe want better contextual information from the excavation to encourage someone to spend the money to do that. So that's basically it. And I'd like to say thank you to Desiree Mobed and the Alden Kindred for hosting me, Evelyn Walker for donating the Walker collection, Dr. Krista Baronic at UMass Boston for all her support of the project, Ed Bell at the Mass Historical Commission for supporting the project as well, the Duxbury Free Library, and all of you here and on Zoom that came out. I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Dan, we have some online.
Take a sip of water. Yes. What do we have?
You can repeat them so people online can make sure they hear.
Sure.
Here. Okay, from Ken, is there any evidence of Native American V-shaped fishing traps in the local streams or rivers?
Ooh, that's a good question. So the question is there any evidence for V-shaped fishing traps or fishing weirs in the local rivers? To my knowledge, no, but I'm not an expert in Plymouth County archaeology. I can tell you that there is not one within a mile of the Alden house because that was my study radius and there was no permanent fish traps there. I wouldn't be surprised if the people living at the site maybe made a weir out of wood that's no longer present. I'm unsure.
So from Polly, who's our former president, did you find anything on this site that you have never seen?
The question is, was anything in this collection that I had never seen before? Personally, yes. So personally, I have never seen a European flint projectile point or arrowhead sort of in person. So that is this one here. But otherwise, I would say the collection is pretty ordinary for the region. Most multi-component sites like this have, or collections that I look at have occupations that date to the last 8,000 years or so. The quartz gun flints were a surprise, but I have seen that before. They're rare, but not totally absent. We have one here. You stretching? No, not you, my cousin Tom.
We have more.
Yeah, please.
Are you able to distinguish when different tribes have occupied the area? That's from Bill.
The question is, are you able to determine or differentiate different tribes occupying the area? And I would say for the most part, the answer is no. If you had a large ceramic assemblage, you might be able to look at the decorative attributes and say that it's more associated with a particular area. But I assume the archaeology in Plymouth County and on Cape Cod, we're talking about the Wampanoag and their ancestors. You know, I think when you go back 7,000 to 8,000 years, it's really hard to tell how people identify. But I assume that they are the ancestors of the people that were here at European contact. You know, I don't see any evidence in the archaeological record of, you know, mass movements of people and things like that. Yes.
To the north of the site, there's a large mound with a cedar tree on it that's never been excavated, that a bunch of people are very interested in looking at, and it's owned by the town of Duxbury school system. And it would be part of the Alden farm, And it's never been disturbed for baseball fields or anything like that. Would you consider that as a future archaeological project?
For myself personally.
For the.
Well, okay, so the question is, there's a large mound, I'm saying this for Zoom, near the site, with a cedar tree on top of it, and it doesn't seem to have been disturbed by any of the ball fields or anything like that around here. And would that be a potential subject for future archaeological investigation? And trying to think of the best way to answer this. I mean, I think anything's possible. It might be worth looking at. I would assume that people may think that it's a burial mound if it's here and they're interested in it. I'm getting a no. Okay. You know, something like that is not something that we would investigate because it's potentially sacred. And I would say I don't really recommend doing archaeology unless something is going to be disturbed. So if the town was going to flatten that for a ball field, yeah, I think it's worth taking a look at. If they're not, I would leave it alone, because in 20 years from now, we'll have better ways to look at that. It might be something to look at with ground penetrating radar, a non-invasive way to investigate. As tempting as it would be to cut it in half with a backhoe, I don't think that necessarily is the way to go. And I don't know of any like really mound native features in New England.
It could
Just
be,
based on your description, I would assume it's a fill pile associated with building the school, and it's just from a really long time ago.
or it could be a colonial reference.
Could be. Maybe I'll take a look at it someday.
What pieces would you recommend seeing on exhibit?
Okay, the question is, what pieces would I recommend to be on exhibit? And I think I would put a little bit of everything out there to really show the whole story. Examples of the range of projectile points, the groundstone tools, things like that people like to look at. I think it'd be interesting to use maybe some of the cores and bifaces and those flakes to do a little depiction of what a stone tool workshop might look like. I think that would be interesting. That's what I would do. No more questions. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming.